Well, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special event hosted by the R Street Institute. My name is Brandon Pugh, and I'm the director of the R Street Institute's Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats team, which leads our data privacy and security work. For those that are not familiar, the R Street Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization. Our mission is to engage in policy research and outreach to promote free markets and limited effective government. A central focus of our team's work has been exploring a nexus between data privacy and data more broadly, with both cybersecurity and national security, along with a need for a comprehensive federal data privacy and security law. Today's event is timely, as both the White House through executive order and Congress through a House bill with unanimous support have explored the threat of countries of concern purchasing and accessing sensitive data on Americans, notably through data brokers, and both have identified mitigation measures. So today we're going to have a keynote and a moderated panel with an opportunity to ask questions from the audience to explore the threat landscape, the recent action, and next steps. So Tarun Chhabra, the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Technology and National Security at the National Security Council, is very disappointed he cannot make it today because of a very timely meeting that came up last minute, and he sends his regrets. However, we're very fortunate to have Eric Johnson join us today, who will also be present for the audience Q&A portion. So by all means, hold your questions for Eric then. And Eric, for those of you who don't know, has been a key leader in the executive order, as well as the resulting rulemaking, so he's a perfect fit. But by way of background, Eric is the Principal Deputy Chief in the Department of Justice's National Security Division. He has an extensive background as an attorney, including as a law professor, an assistant U.S. attorney, and numerous leadership roles at DOJ, from CFIUS to Team Telecom. So, Eric, thanks for joining us today, especially last minute. Thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Brandon, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I welcome the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of my observations of the EO since the president signed it in February. As well as looking forward to the Q&A period at the end of our time here together. Before I dive in, just let me add one thing to the very generous introduction that Brandon gave me. I'm sure folks are saying senior White House official, and now we've got this guy from DOJ, Eric. I will not at all pretend to somehow be able to substitute the wisdom and expertise that someone that Tarun and folks like him would bring. But the one thing that I can offer that I think hopefully we'll see through some of the Q&A is that I am going to be I'm part of the office leadership in the office that's going to be implementing this data EO. So we spent 2 years through an interagency process getting us to this point. What I am going to bring is I'm going to be part of the process that then comes after that. But so let me just some baseline that I'd like to just start out. I'm just going to presume a certain level of familiarity with the EO and the ANPRM. It has been out for a bit, and given what I understand from R Street and its audience, I think that's a fair or a safe presumption to make. So let me just also on baseline touch on an important point, which is the threat, the risk here. These risks that the data EO is designed to address are real, and our intelligence community agrees. ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, has stated our foreign adversaries repeatedly are analyzing and manipulating large data sets for targeting and influence purposes. And so what does that mean? That's blackmail, that's espionage, and that's exploitation of other pattern of life. And ODNI has also said that data, to include sensitive personal data, which is what the EO is focused on, is viewed by our adversaries as a strategic resource. And I think that's a point that we should bear in mind throughout this conversation about the data EO. And this point, the strategic resource, when that is coupled with something like big data analytic capabilities like AI, governments of countries of concern can make their spying, influence, cyber attack operations, other kinetic engagements, those types of vectors, much more targeted and much more effective. So this is a very real risk. And these risks are not only real, but they're also systemic. And what do I mean by that? the threats here are not just through illicit activity by our foreign adversaries, such as state-sponsored hacking, commercial espionage, the purchase of leaked or stolen data, things that I think many, if not all on this call, are going to be familiar with. I mean, that type of activity is akin to what I say, kind of going through the back door. And many here in the audience will be very familiar with those kind of backdoor threat vectors. And while NSD and others in this space, we have to keep our focus on those type of backdoor threats. We need to and have, I would argue, through this EO, turned our attention to the threats that are coming through the front door. So our commercial adversaries right now can acquire data through a variety of commercial relationships in completely lawful ways, including simply buying it on the open market. And in fact, there is no federal law that prohibits our foreign adversaries and their proxies from buying bulk personal data directly in the open market or through what I would characterize as the murky world of data brokers. But once this EO is implemented, hopefully as soon as early next year, it will no longer be legal to sell some of the most sensitive personal data to our foreign adversaries or share it with vendors, employees, investors located in countries of concern without safeguards in place. So the way I think about this and have kind of in my vernacular characterized it, the purpose of the EO is to close the front door on those types of risks, those kind of threats. So when Brandon and others asked me, to speak to you today, what I thought I would maybe do would focus on kind of the issues that have come up through similar engagements that I have been part of. And again, I'm going to presume familiarity with the EO and the ANPRM, not going to kind of walk through the nuts and bolts of that. But again, but wanted to focus on three questions. And the first question that has come up quite a bit is to talk a little bit about what the EO is not. And what it is not privacy focused. In my experience, the default framing for thinking about challenges associated with SPD tends to be in privacy. And while privacy is certainly important and worthy of discussion here and elsewhere, I would argue and suggest that privacy is really the wrong lens through which to focus on this data EO and the set of risks that it is designed to address. So let me pause there, talk a little bit about what I mean by privacy. Privacy, first and foremost, focuses on the individual. And specifically, I think it focuses on the individual's, their right to control the use of their data and their right to control of the collection of their data. And what the EO here is, though, is focused on national security. And that's decidedly not focused on the individual. Rather, the EO and national security is focused on collective risk and externalities. And the risk and externalities that arise for how individuals and businesses choose to sell their data or use their data. And so what does that mean? I like to think of sanctions. We have decided as a country that US businesses cannot sell advanced semiconductor chips to China, to take one example. We also don't let businesses fund certain activities of sanctioned countries or sanctioned persons. So that is, I would argue, the lens through which this EO should be focused through that national security lens. Now, I am very cognizant of there may be knock-on or side effects that are very real and impactful from a privacy perspective, but the takeaway here is that the data EO for all of its focuses is not focused on privacy. So what is the EO? I mean, I'll again come back to my vernacular. It's a national security export regime for a narrow set of sensitive data focused on risks posed by 6 countries. It looks to address risks that arise from the export of data that, as I said in kind of the outset of my remarks, is something that at this point isn't regulated and is unlawful in many instances. The second question that I am often confronted or have been confronted by since the president signed this back in February is why DOJ? And I think that is a very good question, and let me try to take a stab at answering it. DOJ is very familiar with the risks and the risks that this particular EO is designed to address. And what is that risk? It's primarily a counterintelligence risk. And the when you view it as through or framed by a counterintelligence risk, DOJ is the premier domestic counterintelligence agency through the FBI. And DOJ, in my office in the National Security Division, is very familiar with how to, so viewed through a counterintelligence lens, how to address these threats, risks that arise from sensitive personal data. And what do I mean by that? My office is the primary DOJ representative for CFIUS. And through CFIUS, we have decades of experience of dealing with risk in a case-by-case setting that arise from sensitive personal data. And similarly, on Team Telecom, which is the primary authority with which DOJ addresses national security and law enforcement risks that arise from foreign participation in our telecommunication infrastructure, as well as similar licensing issues that arise from applications for subsea cables and the rest of it. That we are also, and through decades of experience, been focused on the risks that come from sensitive personal data. So we have, through those, if you will, reps that we have gone through CFIUS and Team Telecom, developed a very robust appreciation of how to disrupt and or mitigate the risks that arise from foreign adversaries accessing our bulk sensitive data. And the kind of long tail from both of those two authorities is a compliance program that has grown up within DOJ and other members of CFIUS and Team Telecom that not only identifies these risks, but carries through relationships with companies and the other folks who are owe us obligations through what we call national security agreements. We have become very attuned to the requirements of industry in a regulated setting like this, as well as working very closely with other members of the business community, as well as within the interagency here, the IC, the FBI, and other members of the executive branch. So the takeaway on the question of why DOJ is DOJ is taking on a new regulatory role, but it is a role that addresses a basket of risk and an appreciation of everything that comes from those risks that has been well developed and discussed and addressed for at least the last 15 to 20 years on the part of the Department of Justice. So, and then the final thing, the kind of discussion point that I want to introduce for folks, what this means for industry in the immediate term. And I think here is the focus on the immediate term is that companies are going to have to start to develop a risk-based compliance program tailored to your risk profile. And so think about your company, think about what your company has in the way of sensitive personal data. Do you have military personnel data? Do you have financial data? Do you have genomic data? I mean, we are familiar with the categories of data that have been identified, the ANPRM. This is that companies will need to begin to take steps to understand what they have to develop this risk profile. So I have developed, I won't claim authorship to it, I should say, our office has developed a kind of what we call the 4 Knows, KNOWS, how to go about developing this risk profile. The first one is know your data. You're going to just have to know what type of data you have. Know where your data is going. And that includes having an appreciation of existing agreements with whom you have a relationship with, you either trade or sell your data. The third is to know who has access to your data. And this encompasses individuals, companies, vendors, runs the gambit. But who know your data, and then who has access to that data? And finally, know your data sales. Who are you selling this data to, right? How is that working? What are the knock-on effects of it? Goes to one entity, does it go to another entity? And also understand that there is a risk for non-compliance. DOJ is very familiar with it, very comfortable with an enforcement type of posture. And this is not to draw a distinction with other regulatory agencies, but it is to emphasize if you will, a focus that DOJ will bring to this, that is, again, going to be very comfortable with the civil and criminal enforcement mechanisms that exist in IEPA, which of course is the statutory basis for this executive order. But having said that, this isn't all. I don't want to leave the impression that this is all about sticks. I mean, there are definitely not so much carrots, but other ways that this compliance relationship can be brought about. And I think one thing to highlight that I like to leave industry with is that there are ways to talk with us. And chief among those is in the ANPRM, we are contemplating what amounts to an adversarial opinion process. And this is something that OFAC has, and there will be a lot of kind of the echoes of an OFAC type regime in this, and this is one of them. So my message to industry is avail yourselves of that process, because that's how we learn what we don't know from an industry perspective, and that's how also we can provide a bit of certainty to industry about how this regulatory regime is going to work. And then in the same theme there are the please use or please be aware of the general and specific licenses that are contemplated to be available under this regime. And the general licenses is the type of mechanisms that we would use for an industry-based set of challenges in which and perhaps an industry can't come into compliance in the timing that DOJ or the regulatory regime contemplates. Then and a general license would be there with the appropriate explanation for the industry and the rest of it available to you to allow more time to come into compliance, for example. And similarly with the specific licenses that we have or contemplating having, that would allow particular individuals or companies to come forth with a challenge that perhaps falls outside of the categorical of what we see as kind of the categorical purpose of the executive order, and account for business or commercial challenges that we are just not seeing. So that's something that I think bears repeating, and why I mentioned it here is that this isn't just a set of regulations that DOJ is going to launch in the world and will not have any engagement or back and forth with the folks who we are interested in developing a compliance relationship with. So I said I was going to make 3 points. I do want to end with Brandon and others' indulgence here on just one request to the broader audience, and then I'll close my remarks. And that is to please take advantage of the rulemaking process. We're very purposeful within the interagency how we went about doing this with the ANPRM to be followed by the NPRM. And admittedly, we are doing this in a very compressed kind of posture, but what I would like to invite is that folks take advantage of what really amounts to 2 opportunities to have your voice heard, to have your concerns understood. And so I'd like to just end on that appeal that folks take advantage of the rulemaking process because we very much are looking forward to being able to benefit from the industry's views and their concerns. And although, you know, I appreciate that this is recorded, so I need to be careful how I say this, but DOJ often thinks that it has everything right. I'll be the first to admit that we don't. And so use that rulemaking process in the notice and comment period to help point out where we've got things wrong so we can work towards making things better. So with that, again, I very much appreciate the opportunity for R Street has afforded me to speak with you. I do apologize for Tarun and the conflict that arose, but look forward to participating in the Q&A during the latter part of our time here. And with that, I'll turn things back over to Brandon and others.
Well, thanks, Eric. Really appreciate your keynote there. Super insightful, and I know it's left the panel a lot to discuss. And obviously, recommend to anybody in the audience, if you have Q&As in reaction to that, or for the panel, by all means, raise them. But more importantly, like, happy to now introduce somebody that many of you probably have read or have worked with. Alfred has been at Politico for a number of years, covering a wide range of privacy matters. So I'll turn it over to him to kind of kick us off and guide our panel.
Hey, Brandon, thanks for having me. As he mentioned, I am a tech policy reporter at Politico covering data privacy. I'm honored to be moderating this panel today with our esteemed guests who have a deep pool of knowledge and background on data privacy, national security, and tech policy. I've always wanted to say this, that my guests don't need any introductions, but not going to be able to do that today. But I do want to let our panelists introduce themselves. And Brandon, would you like to start?
Yeah, I don't want to take up more time from Alex and Debray, but yeah, briefly speaking, I've been in R Street for a few years, and like I mentioned in my really brief intro, this is a super timely topic. I have a lot of opinions on the EO and the House action, but even on, like, not speaking on behalf of the DoD, let me put that disclaimer out there. But even the military side, this is something I like to focus on a lot, both as a fellow at the Army Cyber Institute, as well as in a teaching capacity. So kind of crosses both sides for my interest, but happy to get in more of the specifics and kind of where I see the framing and some of the threat landscape, after Debray and Alex too.
I guess I'll go next. I'm Alex Joel. I'm currently at the American University, Washington College of Law, at the Tech Law and Security program here. And before that, I spent a bunch of years in the intelligence community, most recently at ODNI for 14 years as the Civil Liberties Protection Officer.
I'm Debray Kennedy Mayo. I am a faculty member in law and ethics at the Scheller College of Business at Georgia Tech, and I'm also a cross-border data forum fellow, senior fellow. And I do research that's really at the intersection of where privacy and cybersecurity conflict, those unintended consequences of privacy in particular on cybersecurity, and also in the regulation of artificial intelligence.
Great. Yeah, I think we've got a great set of panelists today, and I just want to touch on this just because it's so fresh from just now. There was a lot to unpack from Eric's remarks, and what really stuck out to me was, asking industry to help us get this right on the ANPR. What input would you have for the DOJ as they're going through this rulemaking process?
So I'm always happy to speak, but I'll defer to Alex and Debray first if they want to go first. If not, I'm never shy.
So, okay, I'll jump in. I have a lot of different kinds of thoughts. I do think just to echo something Eric was talking about, they've clearly put a lot of time and thought into the ANPRM. It is a very detailed document. There are a bunch of questions in there where they're soliciting input. I think industry is going to have its hands full trying to go through there and figure out what the implications are going to be for them in different kinds of transactions. I do like the 4 no's, and KNOWS. I will say, I guess which does, map very closely onto how companies have been thinking about privacy. I know that the government is disclaiming that this is a privacy regulation. Nonetheless, it's dealing with personal information, understanding who has access to it, where it goes, what your legal obligations are, is very much the work of privacy professionals and has been for decades. So this is all very familiar territory in that sense. I think the issues are going to come in some of the definitions. How are you defining sensitive personal data? How do you define a data brokerage transaction? What fits into a vendor agreement that is restricted and what is going to be excluded, maybe as sort of ordinary business as a company, dealing with HR issues in a branch in China. So there's a lot of issues that as you get into these details, and I'll just sort of tee one up that I think is going to be a big one at the macro level, which is defining sensitive data. They've come up with 6 categories of what they think of as sensitive data. I think there is going to be a number of people who point out that all kinds of personal data could be sensitive, given the inferences you can draw from data. So you could still get to some areas that would be problematic if you fall outside that category. And I'm sure people will argue that you could be inside that category and not raise major issues. So I think there's a lot of work ahead.
And I'll just jump in and say, I agree. Obviously, there's been a lot of work done here. And I think that we're going to get to businesses trying to figure out definitions and what DOJ and really is meant by some of these definitions. One that I think comes up is onward transfer, particularly for data brokers. How are they going to be able to comply, assuming, and I think there will be a lot of US companies that are, very much trying to comply. And so is it going to be sufficient for them to put in this language in a contract that says to a foreign company, no, you're not supposed to do onward transfer that will ultimately lead to China? If we're 4 or 5 links down, is that US company still responsible for that far down the chain? How is the US company supposed to deal with that kind of responsibility or liability? So I think that's one. I think also in some of the definitions that aren't on the bulk side, but really looking at federal employee data and military data, trying to make sure that what is hoped for there actually occurs. Because the language right now seems to be that if data is marketed as either current government or former, per se, a senior level official of the US government. So does that mean that maybe a less trustworthy data broker, maybe a more nefarious one, can just change the marketing and then still be able to have that data flow? So, trying to find ways to make this work and trying to tweak some of the language perhaps to clarify.
Yeah, I think Alex and Debray make great points. Just to add on a few of them. Definitely appreciate Alex's point between the national security and privacy distinction. I understand it's being framed in national security context, as it should, because these are national security consequences, which we can get, happy to explore too. But it does impact the individual directly. Both addressing with the data broker problem, which has been a long-standing issue, then also the second order effects that often impact the individual. We've seen that everything from physical violence to just more effective disinformation campaign and more effective cyber incidents. So yeah, in terms of things I think we get right, it is a very lengthy advanced notice of proposed rulemaking. If everybody hasn't gone through it, I think there's a few things I'm thinking about. It's been kind of driven home. Definitions are key. I think that goes without saying that they'll be really essential to get right in terms of, like, in a classic case of an organization for money selling directly to China and it sends information like a data broker transaction. But are we accidentally including more within that definition of data broker? Perhaps not what we would all traditionally think is a data broker. And then also, like, just thinking out loud, like, what does subject to control mean? Like, we probably all agree we don't want these sales to go directly to the CCP or Russia or you name the country. But is a company now in the position of having to evaluate, is there a 10% ownership stake? Is there a 30% ownership stake? Not to make this too political, but even among a company that's very prominent in the news these days, there's even disagreement in terms of how much connection they actually have to a foreign government. Some say 100% control, some say none. So I don't say that to poke fun, but I do think that it will be a challenge for some businesses to assess the degree of control and may indirectly make compliance challenging. I do think the licensing piece is key as well. I know Eric kind of teed up both types. That'll be key to see how quick and easy they are actually able to get, how generous they are, just to make sure that unintended transactions are not inadvertently stopped. an effort to go after the more severe and sensitive type. So I'll stop there. I have probably a list of things, but go ahead, Bray.
And I'm just going to follow up because both Alex and Brandon have spoken a little bit on the privacy piece. And so I'd like to follow up with that just a bit. Certainly, I think all of us on the panel would agree that it would be really nice if the United States would enact a comprehensive privacy law. And I think that that would have a real impact on part of what the EO is attempting to accomplish. That has to do with data brokers and really limiting down the data that is getting to those data brokers. But I don't think that if it were just a privacy approach, that it would necessarily accomplish this national security goal. So I think we really have two lenses that are being talked about in the bigger spectrum, both with the bill that's been passed related to this in the House and also with you, and really trying to figure out this landscape. And so I just want to interject here that when we think about it from this privacy approach, most people think about GDPR and the EU as being, the privacy enforcers, the best in the world. And I just want to say that if you think about the EU in that way and really think about, let's approach it from privacy, be careful because at least to date, the EU has not enforced against a Chinese-based company related to Chinese government national security gathering of that data. So they likely could under the Schrems 1 and 2 case, but that hasn't been the enforcement. So if it was just an approach from privacy that was being used, it would still have to be enforced. So I think that it's important to realize that the goal here is really being looked at more through that national security lens. And so even though there's some talk about privacy, it really is national security and trying to get to the effects that are coming from the Chinese government. So I just think that's an important point to put into the discussion.
Yeah, Debray, I think that's a good way. The way I see the EO is, some have critiqued it as being some have directly even said it really an inefficient solution, saying like, well, other countries are still going to get at this data in other ways, whether it be hacking, stealing, buying companies with it. I agree. And those are all different avenues to address, but this is one avenue. And that's why I think a comprehensive privacy law is more critical than ever. And I think to the administration's credit, they even directly said in the EO, or it may have been the press release accompanying it, this isn't a substitute for a comprehensive privacy law. That's really key. And I think a lot of people seeing that as being a purely consumer privacy focus, but it has cybersecurity, national security benefits. I mean, take simple things in terms of a mandate around securing the data that is collected. If you're not in a regulated industry, you have no affirmative requirement outside of state laws to protect the data you are collecting. And I think that's a big risk and makes it easier for bad actors to get at that data. And there's also no affirmative requirement to tell your customers or the people you're collecting on that you're transferring their data to China, Russia, Iran. So those are all benefits a comprehensive privacy law, like it's the one from last Congress or any successor one. I think this is a matter of coming at it from different angles, but in each angle, really balancing the need for privacy along with the impact it's going to have on industry and innovation. I think it is finding that balance, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, let me foot stomp everything both of you have said. And I'll just add that some of this is a matter of terminology, right? Because we're talking about privacy, and yet the executive order talks about protecting American sensitive data. And so they're using, you could start thinking of this as protecting personal data, data protection, which in many contexts is very equivalent to privacy. And I think it's an important recognition that in order to protect national security, in order to carry out effective cybersecurity, it is becoming increasingly clear that the U.S. government and other governments recognize the vital importance of protecting personal data. And we can say that is or is not the same as privacy, but data protection at the personal and individual level, protecting individuals from threats of harm from bad actors, be they in China or in other countries or here in the United States, that is, you have very similar sets of measures, cybersecurity measures, authorization measures, access control measures, understanding where your data is, understanding where your data is going. So I, for one, am very excited to consider how we think about data protection from a national security perspective. And I'm really glad that this executive order is going in that direction.
Do you think that this executive order can actually help, set up the infrastructure or the framework for a federal data privacy law, as the ANPR notes, there are specific definitions of what sensitive data is. There are specific definitions of what a data broker is. And right now, there aren't any federal laws basically laying that out. And obviously, there's always a lot of debate about what that looks like or what that's going to be. So do you think by having this executive order, it does at least, create something on the record or a framework that says, no, we're not just pulling this definition out of thin air. This is what the EO defines it as.
So let me just quickly say, yes, I think it is helpful. That doesn't mean that there won't be a lot of conflict and debate about what the EO defines and how it's dividing up the world. I mean, the terminology here, the legal world. But I do think it's very important that the government now is looking at, these concepts of data brokers, sensitive personal data, these categories. I think it's really helpful that the ANPRM provides examples of the kinds of threats that are facilitated when this personal information is sort of not controlled and is allowed to flow around very freely and could be exploited by bad actors. And if you use that as a starting point, you can then go into, okay, maybe is focusing on data brokers the right focus? Is that enough of a focus? How do we, as Debray pointed out, how does the data get into the data broker's hands to begin with? So I think it is a good start for a holistic conversation, but it's just a start, and all the same issues that we've always faced are going to remain.
Yeah, I think they could help one another. I mean, some have questioned where not just the EO, but also the House measure that passed the House unanimously. Some have questioned where those definitions and sensitive data came from. I think the one benefit of a comprehensive privacy law is maybe that could actually make a uniform standard for what sensitive data is. And I know that's easier said than done. We've seen that variations even among the state levels, but a comprehensive privacy law also had, well, depending on which one you're looking at, has data broker provisions. I think what will be interesting is this politically to see how it plays out is I think the EO is much different than the House measure, but there is also similarities. What would happen in a scenario where the House measure is also passed by the Senate and becomes law? Obviously, that would take the president, so there would have to be some coordination among the EO in that. But that would be an interesting scenario, and I know some members of industry are questioning a scenario like that now.
And I'll just jump in and say, I hope that what we're going to see is more attention back on having a discussion really in the news about, yes, we need to also have a comprehensive privacy bill that gets passed. And I think that would be, a real step forward to just have that conversation. All of us are talking, about different aspects of it. And also, hopefully, part of what would be there is a discussion of artificial intelligence and how that also plays in and what would make sense as far as appropriate regulation.
Yeah, speaking of artificial intelligence, so in Eric's remarks, he talks about how when this massive pool of data collection is combined with something like artificial intelligence with these new abilities, not so much new, but I think just much more capable than it was in previous years. I think that really changes what the threat landscape looks like, right? Like it's not what the same threat landscape that it was maybe 4 years ago. And I think if you're on this call, you probably have some kind of understanding of what the threat landscape is. But I am curious, how does this change with artificial intelligence and big data analytics capabilities now thrown into the mix?
So I'll just start quickly there on that point. So the documents and statements that the government has released and some of the warnings from the intelligence community do point out that the advent of technologies like artificial intelligence is going to create new challenges and is creating new challenges from a national security perspective. So it's in a couple of ways. One is that countries that are adversarial countries that are developing these systems need a lot of data. So they're going to be grabbing a lot of data. They want data from countries that they want to target, either for foreign influence campaigns or for identifying targets for espionage or potential phishing, campaigns, et cetera, to try to gain access to critical infrastructure and do other things that could potentially, in Eric's words, facilitate kinetic effects. In other words, shutting down critical infrastructure because they've gained access by exploiting personal information, and their ability to exploit that information is really magnified and amped up by the advent of artificial intelligence technology. There's also the simple competitive race between countries to develop these technologies. So I feel like it's directly relevant. It's not the only part of the problem, obviously, but it as you pointed out, it sort of raises it by an order of magnitude.
And I'll just try and give an example that I think relates directly to the EO, which again is back to the federal government employee data. Right now, that restriction that's going to be on there about marketed as that type of data. Well, with artificial intelligence, if the data just flows and say, there are X number of data that relates to either employees, federal employees, or military, the country of concern is likely to already have large databases, and they'll be able to use that artificial intelligence to provide that into profiles that related to the individual people. And then you're going to get more information, say, about the location or other sensitive information about that. So I think the concern is certainly, as it's already been said, really heightened with artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because really for years, we've seen certain countries like China collecting as much information and data as they possibly can, not only of their own citizens, but on Americans and our allies. And we've unfortunately, to really just drive home a concrete example that Eric was referencing, we've seen this play out, even the Russia-Ukraine conflict in Israel-Palestine. Take Russia-Ukraine, for example. So apart from China, we've seen members of the military and the government targeted for physical violence as well as disinformation purely because the data collection and how they are able to analyze it and process that. And I do think that is a risk with AI, is that our adversaries are going to continue to use it. However, I will say on the opposite side, I'm very optimistic with the tech can actually help security and privacy. So I do think it's a measure of both. Looking as a country how we're going to embrace it and leverage it for defense, knowing bad actors are going to use it regardless of what we do in the United States, which is, unfortunate reality.
And I've also, I've seen some criticisms of the EO basically saying something along the lines of, well, China is still going to be able to get Americans' data through this way or through some other way. And sometimes it feels like a bit misplaced in the sense that I don't think that this EO is set out to address everything, right? It even said in the announcement that, there are other things that need to be done, especially, of note, a data privacy law. And I do want to kind of look at this EO more as a puzzle piece, right, rather than the entire picture. But I am interested in your thoughts on what does this entire picture look like, and how does this EO as a puzzle piece fit into it?
So if I could just jump in there and start, I love the analogy of a puzzle piece and looking at the overall picture, because I think that's exactly right. And we heard it in how Eric presented this particular measure coming out of the Department of Justice and seated in the Department of Justice and drawing on CFIUS expertise and experience. And there's also another executive order on information and communications technologies and the supply chain. We had the Department of Commerce issue an ANPRM on connected vehicles and the possibility that adversarial nations would use technology in connected vehicles to collect information and also to as a vector for potentially controlling those or shutting down those vehicles. So it is what I see happening is the government has a certain array of legal tools at its disposal. Unless Congress enacts additional authorities right now, the experts in government that are worried about the nation's security and seeing this pressing threat from particularly China, but also Russia and other countries, are pulling the legal levers that they have at their disposal, the ones they're very familiar with, closing gaps. And these are tactical and targeted measures, which I think the administration itself has emphasized several times. It's a targeted approach. And I applaud them for that. I think that's great that they're doing that. I think, though, that we should take a step back. As you say, what does the overall puzzle look like? What is the overall strategic picture? And how does this mesh with calls for companies to raise their shields on cybersecurity? How does it mesh with work at DHS and CISA? All of those things. I know there are interagency processes dealing with the big picture, but I feel that we need a national data protection strategy to get all elements of government power aligned and start focusing with our foreign allies and partners. Are we taking aligned measures across the federal government with the private sector and across, along with our alliances, to identify and counter these threats through the whole range of legal measures that we have collectively available as democracies. So I think that it would be very much helped out if we had something like a national data protection strategy. We have a national security strategy, a national intelligence strategy, a national cybersecurity strategy. At least data protection should be a segment of each one of those strategies, if not its own.
Well, there you go. Alex announced our new strategy, and we have we have some bullet points from underneath it. But no, Alex said a really important point, and I really agree with it. This is one way that adversaries and bad actors are getting data. We should not stop our other ways. I mean, take the national cybersecurity strategy, for instance. They had a similar call out of a national privacy law and a need for addressing collection like this. But it's only one measure. This doesn't mean we should stop our traditional cybersecurity protections and initiatives, whether it be secure by design, secure by default. Those should all continue because bad actors are going to continue to exploit some of our systems and hack it and even acquire new businesses. So that's none of that's going to stop, but this does address part of the problem. And for any policymakers listening or may watch this in the future, I would be looking at what could we do from a Congress to also get at some of these concerns. Is there anything we need to do legislatively because the executive doesn't have the authority, or because we think that Congress is better suited to be the policymaker and policy call there? And I have to say, I've gotten a lot of questions like, well, how is this actually different than CFIUS? And I don't want to profess to be the CFIUS expert like Eric, but I think what this does is it takes away from a case-by-case basis and makes it more, generally applicable rules with exemptions and carve-outs and the ability for licenses. I think that is the difference between how we've applied traditional authorities. And when Eric comes later, he can feel free to disagree if that's a mischaracterization, but that's how I see it.
And my step back is gonna be a little bit different in an approach, because I think there's right now perhaps some mixed messaging. When we try to look, and Alex, I love the idea. I hope that it is what gets accepted. But I think across the board, when we look at trade and some of the trade negotiations that's been going on, particularly the WTO e-commerce negotiations and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where the U.S. has backed off of the free flow of data there. I think this particular EO by some has been interpreted as the U.S. moving in an area in a different way than it has been before. I know there are commentators both in China and in India that have said, maybe the U.S. is really changing its approach and how it feels. There's some underlying discussion that still needs to be had about, free flow of data with trust and what that aspect of trust really means. But right now, I think some of the messaging is coming across less than clear for some who are looking at the messaging from the U.S.
And we do still have our Q&A section coming up soon, but I did just want to ask all of our panelists, I guess I'll be the first to do the Q&A. If you have any kind of final thoughts on Eric's remarks or this EO that you were dying to talk about on this call, but didn't get to mention.
Yeah, let me just jump in on DeBray's very good point. I think it's critical. Part of the reason that I'm calling for more of a strategic approach here, and I know that DOJ is going to have its hands more than full just getting through this ANPRM and the NPRM to later, but we need somebody in government really thinking about that global picture so that this isn't a step toward data localization, which I think would be a mistake, that we continue to support the term of art in this area is data free flow with trust. We want data to be shared with appropriate safeguards with democracies that operate under the rule of law and are going to have aligned ways of dealing with government access to data in a trusted manner, and distinguishing ourselves from authoritarian regimes, adversary countries that don't follow those rules and do not operate under the rule of law. So I think it's critical that the U.S. continue to lead in that area and that this not be perceived as something that is a step backward.
Yeah, I think really that one of the biggest takeaways here is we've seen a lot of discrete mentions of how data has national security consequences over the years, whether it be directors of our federal agencies or in the annual threat assessment, as Eric alluded to. It's been mentioned multiple times, but there's been little concrete action. I think there's a lot of work to go, both in the EO and the legislative side, in terms of making sure we get the rulemaking right. And it sounds like DOJ is very open to that. So I do think this is part of the solution, and just getting it right is critical. I am still a huge advocate of broader action by Congress on a privacy law. I think that's a very complete solution, but would require legislative action. So I think that's the really optimistic side, is that we are at least flagging an issue that's been longstanding and a critical vulnerability to the country.
And certainly, I'm very glad to see DOJ really out explaining what they're doing and trying to clarify, and really, with a list of questions that are in what's out there right now related to rulemaking, really trying to gather some information. And, I think that's a real positive. I agree there's a lot of work still to be done. And I'm glad that they're looking to try and find out, are there other exemptions that we need to put in? Certainly making sure cybersecurity still works well, I would personally think it is one that is a real focus, but there are others as far as medical research and academic research, so the work is ongoing, and certainly so is the conversation.
All right, can we have Eric join us back for this portion now? I'm very curious to hear his thoughts on all of this.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I was furiously making notes here. Let me just touch on maybe just one thing that was actually at the outset, that and then what I'd like to do is just kind of turn it over to the broader audience. But this will not be a strict liability regime, right? So getting back to a question that was at the top, so what happens, if a bad thing happens? Well, I mean, maybe unlike OFAC and some of the other regimes that are out there, this is not strict liability. This is a knowingly regime, and so facts will matter, and the circumstances in which a unfortunate transfer of information to a foreign adversary or a country of concern, it won't just be the fact of that happening that will drive an enforcement or a compliance engagement, but rather just the facts will in fact matter. So this kind of comes back to what I was saying towards the end of my comments, which was, what does this mean for industry in the immediate? It means setting up a risk-based compliance program. And the emphasis there is have a program, right? Have a way to address and deal with, the four no's that I mentioned in my comments. So, we are not looking to just, again, find ways, if you will, to penalize folks. What we're trying to do is help companies think about the data, think about what up to this point have been lawful commercial transactions, and how the regs are changing that, and how we can help companies build out a risk-based profile. And to the larger point of privacy, perhaps I came in a little too strong on this. I did not and am not at all suggesting that a broad federal-based privacy regime would be a bad idea. Quite to the contrary. I do like the point about the interlocking puzzle, or the puzzle pieces. I agree with that this is part of the puzzle that will fill out the larger risk picture, or the mitigation of that risk picture. But very much privacy is an important topic, one worthy of discussion. And to the extent that this data EO addresses some of those privacy concerns, wonderful. And certainly something that we would embrace. But again, just to come back to what I said at the outset, I would not want to see this data EO to be viewed only through the lens of privacy, but rather through a national security lens. So again, I don't want to hog all the time, so I will stop there and look forward to further questions and others' comments.
Yeah, I'm going to turn over to audience questions now. And our first question actually comes from Miriam, who asked something that I've actually been wondering myself, because I've been covering the House bill that's very similar to this executive order pretty closely. And one thing that I had noticed is there is not as much opposition to the House bill as there has been on the executive order, at least not opposition, but maybe industry resistance is the better way to describe it. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on why? Well, I'm also curious what Miriam asked. If you could talk a bit about why there's been so much resistance to the EO compared to this House bill that really does seem kind of very similar.
Oh, go ahead,
Go ahead.
Brandon.
No, go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to point out that I mean, the House bill, I mean, even though it did get such incredible support, it's still a House bill. So, I mean, I think just one of the practical answers is that there's still more steps in that process. And the executive order is real. It's going to happen. I think more people are more focused. I do want to point out, even though they are similar in goals, they are very different in how they achieve those goals. Very, very different. So the House bill is making this more of a privacy issue, putting it in the FTC's lap, which is, of course, not the approach of the executive order. So I would say that's a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Another thing I would say is the House bill did move very quickly. For those that are not familiar, it was tied to the TikTok bill, essentially, the divestment bill, moved in the same day out of committee, but then voted on separately, but had unanimous support out of the House. It was a very fast-moving bill. I say that with the caveat that the House and Energy and Commerce has been looking at this issue for a long time. Not I don't want to, at the risk of sounding like I'm self-promoting, but when a colleague of Debray and I, Sam Sachs, and I testified in ENC 2 years ago, it was on this very topic, was around how adversaries are collecting a lot of information on Americans, notably China, and what the US can do about it. So it's been on ENC and the chair and ranking members' priority list for a long time, but obviously this measure came about pretty quickly, and I think moved quicker than some had thought. But to Alex's point, very different measure, and I think there's strengths and weaknesses between the two. Just to be candid, I think that bill is looking to the FTC. It has a broader sensitive data definition, but at the same time, it takes a narrower approach on some of the other types of transactions, hyper focus on data brokers in the traditional sense with PII. So definitely distinctions worth following, and we'll see what the Senate does.
And I would just echo these points. And also, the definition, I believe, of data broker is there's a significant difference related to service provider, which, may or may not really factor into this calculus. But again, I think it's early in the process as part of the reason we're not seeing as much interest or discussion of the bill right now.
Yeah, our next question comes from Gerald. Thanks for submitting this. It asks, what should the industry infer about the silence in the EO about data being sold to U.S. intelligence agencies and the broader U.S. government? At the very least, it would seem to suggest that the sale of data to the U.S. government is not as dangerous to national security as the countries listed in the EO. I know that this is a concern that's been brought up a few times as well when the EO was announced, and I am curious what your answer to this is.
Well, I guess I'll take a first swing at that. What should you infer? That the U.S. government is not as dangerous as the PRC? Yes, you should infer that. It's an authoritarian regime, and say what you like about our government, but it's not an authoritarian regime. I have no problem being very straightforward about that. I don't see any similarity between what the U.S. intelligence services are doing and what the PRC intelligence services are doing, or the North Korean or Russian or other intelligence agencies of those identified countries of concern.
So let me just jump. I, of course, agree with that entirely. I don't know if the phrasing was meant the way it was written there, but yeah, of course, the U.S. government is accessing the data for national security purposes to protect national security. But I think the implicit question there is, what does this mean for potential legislation restricting U.S. government access to data out of the concern for people's privacy and civil liberties? I know that people may be aware that the Director of National Intelligence commissioned an external advisory group to provide a study on access to commercially available information by the intelligence community. So they published that study. It's out on the web. And they are, I understand, working on measures to, on a response to that, to the recommendations in that study. So it'll be interesting to see, how the U.S. government addresses the concerns that have been raised about commercially available information. And of course, as I said, there are bills that seek to restrict the sale of personal data in a commercial sense to the U.S. government. I think that's a very distinct issue. That's more of a self-government in our democracy, and how do we trust our own agencies to deal with information about Americans, than it is to prevent a foreign government from maliciously exploiting it for their own purposes in ways that are designed to undermine our nation's security.
And so I would agree with points that have already been made. You know, the Fourth Amendment is not for sale. That bill that has been out there for some time is one of the bills trying to address this. I will just say that back to the comprehensive privacy law, that if we restrict the amount of data that data brokers have, it is certainly one way to address what would be for sale for the U.S. government to purchase. So, you know, me personally, I think that trying to get to the comprehensive privacy approach makes sense for the United States.
Yeah, and to Alex's point, like I do think they're distinct but related issues. Like there are other measures out there looking at the government's use of data. I mean, not to single out a couple, but ones we've been working on is like the Fourth Amendment is not for sale act, then the Protecting Americans' Data from Foreign Surveillance Act. Multiple proposals out there. Some have moved farther than others. But they, you know, I don't know. You know, I can speak to like some of the DoD work, but like even looking at the NDA from last year as a provision that, you know, future contracts restrict the ability of the government to transfer data. And looking at like the acquiring side as well. So definitely in the works, and not to really expand this panel, but like we even say some of this, you know, with certain measures that need reauthorization now. Like we see some of these questions coming up when people have varying differences when it comes to comfort. Some are more national security leaning, some are more privacy leaning. So you know, I think it is a broader conversation of where, you know, Americans sit on some of these issues.
Yeah, and you know, we only have time for I think like one or two more questions. But you know, Patrick asked, you know, multinational corporations tend to store their data in multiple places that often cross international borders. And how does this executive order kind of impact this reality? Could it potentially push, you know, the balkanization of data even further?
I'd be curious to get Eric's response and others, but just quickly to jump in on that question, I think the focus is less on where the data is stored and more on where persons are located, and whether those persons are subject to the jurisdiction of the country of concern, such that the country of concern could require that person with access to data, to turn over the data. So you'd look at the definition of covered persons, and you think about whether or not that person has a relationship such that they could, under order from a country of concern, be required to turn over data. And the data might or might not be residents in that country, right? So I think that's my reaction. I don't know if I got that right, Eric.
Yeah, no, I think you did. Yeah, that is responsive to it. You know, I would also just add, there are measures that CISA is going to suggest to allow otherwise prohibited transactions to go forward. So if you want to use cloud services that are being provided by a company in a country of concern, that is going to be a, if you will, covered transaction. That's going to be a covered entity. And CISA is going to provide a set of cybersecurity standards that potentially could apply in that situation, in which you could go forward with storing your data as long as the access that Alex just referenced there is cut off or otherwise controlled. So it is, I would argue, a bit nuanced. So will it lead to the balkanization of this? I don't think so. I think what it'll lead to, I'm hoping, is getting back to my 4 no's. It'll just require companies to know, you know, what data they have and who has access to it and where is it being stored, et cetera. And then avail yourselves of the various standard cybersecurity control and the rest of it that CISA is going to be putting in part of the NPRM to address some of the commercial concerns that may arise from those prohibitions.
And I just wanted to say that in the ANPRM, that they've done a very good job of providing examples of what they mean. And this is a nuanced question, but it is addressed. A very similar question is addressed there in one of the examples. And again, with a statement that data localization is not the attempt by the US government in this executive order.
Yeah, well, in the interest of time, this is obviously an issue I'm passionate about, and it sounds like everybody else here too. So I know we could go on for literally hours, but I really want to thank Alfred. Thanks for kindly moderating today, and for your work covering privacy more broadly. Alex DeBray, thanks for being in the panel. Eric, of course, thanks for stepping in last minute. And most of all, thanks for the listeners today, especially those that are in the Hill and and others that have a variety of commitments and you chose to listen in. We really thanks for that. I think we had a great conversation that showed the importance of data and national security, along with the opportunities and challenges around policy in that space. But at our street, we always enjoy collaborating, having conversations across all ideologies, and that's something we truly mean. So please don't hesitate to reach out if we can collaborate or be a resource. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.